If you haven't done so yet, please subscribe to the channel. And if you're enjoying these stories, there's a link below to buy me a cup of coffee. This is the Chassidic Story Project with Barak Hullman, podcasting from Jerusalem, Israel. This podcast is sponsored by listeners just like you. To become a supporter of this podcast, please go to HasidicStory.com. HASIDIC story.com. You'll never know. You'll never know. You'll never know. You'll never know. Shalom Aleichem, my sweetest friends. It's another week, and I have some more Chassidic stories for you, Be'ezrat Hashem. We had a beautiful bar mitzvah on Shabbos. Levi Yitzchak did an amazing job. And I bless everyone just with revealed good family time, health, parnasa, only good things, Be'ezrat Hashem. So before I begin, I want to dedicate this podcast episode, Be'ezrat Hashem, to the continued success of our soldiers in battle wherever they are, the returning of all the hostages, healthy and alive, the refuah shlema, the full recovery of everybody who's been injured or who is ill, the comforting of those that lost loved ones, and the continued unity of the Jewish people here in the land of Israel and all around the world. The first story takes place around 1860, in the time of Tsar Alexander II's reign in Russia. And of course, as you know, if you listen to the podcast, the Jews were limited to certain places in Russia where they could live. The Pale of Settlement, it was called. There were restrictive laws. They suffered poverty. But there was one wealthy Jew who lived near Vitebsk, whose name was Reb David Fried. Now, for many years, Reb David was a successful fish merchant, and he was known throughout the region for being honest and having a good business sense. And Baruch Hashem, he lived in a big fancy home and always had lots of food. But as you know, a person's fortune in this world is like a wheel. Sometimes you're on the top, and sometimes you're on the bottom. And there was a fish shipment that had showed up that was spoiled before it got to market. There was a fire in his warehouse. One of the middlemen stole money from him, and before Reb David knew it, he had lost everything. This once respected businessman was left with nothing but debts, and he had no choice but to sell his house. His wife and their children moved into her parents' home, and they lived in a fairly small house at the edge of town. But Reb David, who had the stubborn pride of a former wealthy and successful businessman, refused to move into his in-laws' house. He told his wife, "I can't be a burden on your parents." And he took a few things and left the home, and he said, Be'ezrat Hashem, when I can provide again, I'll be back. And not knowing where to go, Reb David went to the town shul and started living there. During the day, he would sit with his siddur, praying with a broken heart, and at night he would sleep on a hard wooden bench, using his coat as a blanket. And the caretaker of the shul, seeing this, would sometimes leave him bread and a cup of tea, which Reb David would only eat after he made sure that nobody else in the shul needed the food. And this went on for many months, his wife and children coming to visit him every day. And when winter came, the cold seeped through the walls of the old shul, and David, not having much to eat, started losing a lot of weight. Once he was a fat man, which was a rare thing in those days, but now it looked like he'd aged. His beard turned white, and worse than the physical changes was what happened to his soul. The light in his eyes had dimmed, and he had a vacant stare that looked beyond anyone in this world. And out of nowhere one day, a group of Chabad Chassidim came to visit the synagogue. And they decided to establish a regular class in Chassidic teachings. These were the Chassidim of the Tzemach Tzedek, the third Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who lived from 1789 to 1866. And for several weeks, these Chassidim noticed there was a quiet man sitting in the corner, keeping to himself. He would barely touch the food the people left for him, and sometimes he would stop in the middle of davening and just stare out the window. And finally, one of the Chassidim, who himself was a businessman, went over to Reb David and said, "Shalom Aleichem, I've seen you many times here. My name is Yosef." So David looked up and he said, David Fried. And Reb Yosef said, "Fried, are you the famous fish merchant?" And Reb David had a bitter smile, and he said, "Well, once I was, but look at me now." And the Chassidim listened to his story, and when he finished, they said, "You have to go see the Rebbe." And Reb David said, "What's the Rebbe? What can the Rebbe do?" And one of the other Chassidim said, "What can the Rebbe do? The Rebbe has holy vision. He can see things that you and I can't. When we see only darkness, the Rebbe sees light." After sitting in that shul for many months, brokenhearted, something changed in David. He thought maybe, just maybe, the Rebbe can see something that he can't. The Chassidim put together enough money just for him to get to the Rebbe and back. And he said to them, "But I could never go to the Rebbe wearing tattered clothes like what I have now." And the Chassidim said, "Don't worry, David. The Rebbe sees beyond the clothes. He knows exactly what you're thinking. He knows everything that's going on with you. All you have to do is stand there in front of him. He won't see your clothes, trust me. He'll only see your neshama." And so, he had a little money and a little encouragement, and he got on the train and went to Lubavitch. And it was a long trip, but for the first time in months, he felt like he had some purpose. When he arrived in Lubavitch, Reb David was so overwhelmed by the amount of people running back and forth, Chassidim of all ages, some sitting and learning, some walking about. He felt completely out of place and was so embarrassed by his clothes, he almost went back to the train. But then he remembered the Chassidim saying that the Rebbe doesn't see the clothes, he just sees the neshama. And as he was standing there, the Gabbai, the Rebbe's secretary, came over to him and said, "Are you here to see the Rebbe?" And he said, "Yes." And the Gabbai said, "Normally, it takes many weeks to get in to see the Rebbe, but someone just canceled, and if you like, I can take you in right now." So David said, "Sure." And before he knew it, he was sitting in the chair waiting for the Rebbe's door to open, and he's trying to go over his whole story, how he's going to tell it to the Rebbe. But when the moment finally came and he stood in front of the Tzemach Tzedek, all of the words that he had prepared to say simply vanished. The Rebbe looked at him, and Reb David could feel that he was looking straight into his soul. He felt tears welling up in his eyes, but he couldn't say a word. And he figured, well, it doesn't matter anyhow. If the Rebbe can really see into my soul, I don't have to say anything. And was completely quiet in the room. And then the Rebbe closed his eyes for a second, and he said, "Go to Berlin, bracha v'atzlacha," a blessing and success. And that was it. No business plan, no blessing, just go to Berlin. And so Reb David backed out of the room, bowed to the Rebbe out of respect and gratitude, and outside of the Rebbe's room, he's trying to understand what just happened. Berlin? In Germany? It was like the Rebbe was telling him to go to the moon. He didn't have any money besides the money to get back. He didn't speak German. He didn't know anyone in Berlin. What was he supposed to do in Berlin? And the more he thought about it, the more impossible it seemed. And by the time he was on the train, headed back home, he decided that for sure the Rebbe's a tzaddik, but maybe he's losing it a little bit. And when he finally got back, the Chassidim ran over to him and said, "No, David, tell us, what did the Rebbe say?" And he said, "What did the Rebbe say?" He said, "Go to Berlin." So the Chassidim looked at each other with amazement. And they said, "No, David, when are you leaving?" And David said, "I'm not going anywhere. I don't have any money. I don't know anyone. I can't even speak the language. What am I going to do in Berlin?" But for the Chassidim, if the Rebbe said to go to Berlin, then David was going to go to Berlin. One of the Chassidim said, if the Rebbe said Berlin, then your salvation is waiting for you there. But David was insistent. He didn't have the money. He didn't want to go. The Rebbe didn't know what he was talking about. What could there possibly be for him in Berlin? And for 3 days, the Chassidim worked on him. They told him stories of other people gone to the Rebbe and had remarkable miracles happen. They reminded him of his family and how he used to be successful. And eventually they got together enough money for him to go to Berlin and stay in a cheap hostel for several weeks. And reluctant, very reluctant, Reb David agreed to go. What finally convinced him was when his wife and children came to visit another time. And each time they came, his face was thinner and thinner. He had to get out of this. And so he bought the train ticket to Berlin. It was a long and uncomfortable ride. And he watched the landscape changing from the Russian countryside to the very orderly German territory. And the closer he got to Berlin, the more anxious Reb David became. And when finally there, he was overwhelmed by the grand buildings, the huge amount of wealth, all the people in the streets. Everyone seemed to have a purpose, except for him. He found a cheap room in a boarding house in an area where some Yiddish-speaking Jews lived. And each morning, he would get up and daven, and then simply walk the streets. What was he looking for? He didn't even know. One day passed into the next, and his thought that the Rebbe was just senile became stronger and stronger. He tried to write a letter to his wife, promising that he would have good news soon, but he felt like he was just lying to her. And after another week of just walking around the city, Reb David found himself on a commercial street he hadn't been to before. Tired and hungry, he stopped in front of a fish market, and he looked at the display of fresh fish on beds of ice. And for a moment, he remembered his own business days. The smell of fish, the haggling, the satisfaction of making money. And he was so lost in these memories that he didn't realize that the shop owner was staring at him. And he says to David in German, "You know fish?" David was a little startled. He looked up and he sees this short, red-faced man with big arms. Obviously somebody who spent his whole life carrying heavy crates. And Reb David said, "I speak a little bit of German," because of course Yiddish has a lot of German in it. So the two of them were able to communicate. And the fishmonger, he says to David, "It looks to me like you know fish. You're a professional. Are you in the business?" And Reb David stood up straight and he said, "Well, once I was in Russia for many years." And the fishmonger said, "Russia? There's good fish in Russia. Come in. I'm Heinz Mueller." So Reb David figured he has nothing to lose. He goes into the shop, once again smelling the fish, and all of the sights awaken something in him. Heinz said to David, "I have a problem. Just come with me." They go to the back of the shop, and he says, "I have a big problem. Maybe you can help me." In the storage room there were rows of barrels, and Heinz pried open one of the barrels, showing fresh carp packed in ice. And he said, "I have 100 barrels of carp. Came here yesterday. I only ordered 20, but they sent 100, and they said it's my problem and I have to pay for them." So Reb David, with his expert eye, he looked at the fish, he started checking the gills and the eyes and the firmness of the flesh, and he knew right away these were very excellent fish. Heinz says to him, "Good stuff, right?" And David said, "Yes, very good, but I can't afford to buy them from you." Heinz says to him, "Listen, I can't get rid of 100 barrels before they spoil, and I can't afford to lose all this money." Heinz put his hand through his thinning hair in frustration, and he says, "Listen, David, you want to buy them? I'll sell them to you for 10 marks a barrel. You'll sell them, you'll make a profit, and you'll pay me back." And Reb David laughed and he said, "I don't have any money and I don't know anyone here." So Heinz said, "No problem. You and I will sign a contract. You'll take the fish, you'll sell it, and a week later, you'll pay me back. I trust you. You're obviously a professional." Now for Reb David, this was insanity. 100 barrels of fish, but he felt like maybe he could sell these. He did know how to sell large quantities of fish, and maybe this is why the Rebbe sent him here. So Heinz could see that David wasn't making a decision. So he said, "Okay, 9 marks a barrel. Sign here, I'll deliver them tomorrow, and you can pay me after you sell them, okay?" So Reb David says, "And where am I going to store them?" And Heinz said, "No problem. I have a friend. He has a warehouse that he's not using now. For a small amount of money, you can use the warehouse." So the next thing David knows, he's signing a contract. And Heinz wrote out 2 copies in meticulous German. Both men signed them, and he left the shop with a contract tucked in his pocket. Reb David wondered if maybe he had just made things much worse for himself. He just spent 1,000 marks on something that he has no idea if he can sell. Who would buy 100 barrels of carp in a city where nobody knows him? That whole night he could barely sleep. He was scared that he had just made things much worse. And in the morning he decided he was going to go to the fish market and try to find somebody to buy the barrels. Maybe he could sell them for 10 marks and he would make 100 marks. That would be good. But before he could leave, there was a loud knocking on the door. "Herr Fried! Hallo! Herr Fried, are you there?" He hears people knocking on the door and he opens the door and he sees 4 well-dressed men standing there. And the smell was unmistakable. These were fish dealers. And they stuck out their hands and they said, "Mr. Fried, it's our honor to meet you." And David had no idea what was going on. They said, "Sir, we understand that you bought 100 barrels of carp from Mueller yesterday. Is that correct?" And Reb David says, "Yes." They said, "Fantastic. There's been an unexpected shortage in the market. There was a shipment from Hungary that didn't arrive, and we're having a major banquet for a very important person, and we need that carp. We went to Heinz, and he said he already sold it to you." So Reb David stood there speechless, And then one of the fish merchants said, "We're willing to pay 90 marks a barrel." And he took out 9,000 marks. And Reb David was so shocked he didn't say anything. So one of the other merchants said, "Okay, we'll make it 100 marks, but that's our final offer." So you see how, my friend, sometimes you're on the bottom and sometimes you're on the top. With trembling hands, Reb David accepted the money and handed over his contract with Heinz to the fish merchants. They shook his hand. They were very pleased despite the high price. And as they left, Reb David sat on his bed looking at 10,000 marks. And he wondered, is this real? But he felt the money, and it was real. And later that day, he went to Heinz's shop, and the fishmonger was shocked to see him there. He said, "You sold them all so fast?" And Reb David said, "Yep, all of it." And he counted out 900 marks, and then he added another 100, and he said, "For your honesty and kindness." And on his way home, Reb David didn't just restart his business. He learned all of his lessons from the past, and he built an even bigger business than he had before, training his sons in the business while making sure they always had time to sit and learn Torah. And when his family was settled in their new home and his business was thriving, Reb David went to Lubavitch, this time dressed in fine clothes and standing up straight and proud. He entered the Rebbe's room, and the Rebbe said to him, "Did you find what you needed in Berlin?" And Reb David said, "Yes, Rebbe, but it wasn't just the fish or the money that I was looking for. In Berlin, I found the emunah, the trust in Hashem, that I had lost when my business collapsed." And the Rebbe smiled and said, "Sometimes, Reb David, the long way is actually the short way." You see, my sweetest friends, the Rebbe didn't send Reb David to Berlin to find fish. He sent him to find emunah. And so it is with each of us sometimes, that the journeys that seem most uncertain are often the very paths that Hashem has prepared for our salvation. May we merit to walk on those paths with emunah, even when where we're going remains hidden from our eyes. Hi, good Shabbos, good Shabbos, good Shabbos. I have another story for you. In the town of Barak, also around the time of 1890, there was a great Torah scholar whose name was Rabbi Avraham Yehuda HaKohen Schwartz, who lived from 1824 to 1883, and he was known as the Kol Aryeh, of course named after the Holy Sefer that he put out. And his name became known throughout the whole Jewish world. No, the Kol Aryeh wasn't just any rabbi. He was a devoted chassid of the Holy Sanzer Rebbe, Reb Chaim Halbertstam, who lived from 1793 to 1876, and was known as the Divrei Chaim, one of the greatest tzaddikim of his generation, one of the biggest rebbes of all time. For 26 years, the Kol Aryeh would go to Sanz for the holiday of Shavuot, leaving behind his community and his family to bask in the presence of the Rebbe. And each time he visited for Shavuot, the Sanzer Rebbe would honor him by calling him up to the Torah for the first Aliyah of Cohen, even though there were many other Kohanim in the community. And it happened once that the Sanzer Rebbe found himself in a difficult situation. There was an innocent Jew that had been imprisoned just so some Russian authorities could make money from the Jews. They demanded a huge sum of money for his release, and much more than the Sanzer Rebbe had. This, of course, is the mitzvah of Pidyon Shvu'im, the redemption of captives, which our sages of blessed memory teach us is one of the most important mitzvot. And the Sanzer Rebbe, knowing how urgent it was, sent a telegram to his chassid in Barak, and he said he needed to raise a huge amount of money for this mitzvah of Pidyon Shvu'im. And when the Kol Aryeh received the telegram, he didn't hesitate even for a second. He could have asked his students or his assistants to go around and collect the money, but he personally took to the streets of the city, going home to the wealthy Jews from morning until evening until he collected all of the money. And with great joy, he immediately sent the money to his beloved Rebbe in Sanz. And when the Sanzer Rebbe received the money and successfully redeemed the prisoner, he wrote a letter to the Kol Aryeh And at the end of the letter, he said, whenever you need a Yeshua, a salvation, this mitzvah will come to serve you. And those weren't just words of thanks from a great tzaddik like the Sanzer Rebbe. Those words carried their weight in the heavenly court. And only a few weeks later, the Kol Aryeh was sitting and learning, and he collapsed in the shul. He had a hemorrhage, a rupture of a blood vessel, and his condition was so grave, the local doctors immediately told him to go to Vienna, where the most advanced medical care was available at the time. And as they prepared for the journey, the Kol Aryeh, even though he was weak and in pain, he remembered the promise of the Rebbe, and he whispered to one of his attendants, send a telegram to the Holy Sanzer Rebbe and remind him of his promise. And by the time they arrived in Vienna, it was the middle of the night. They rushed into the great hospital there. The doctors that received him were very concerned. A hemorrhage like this could be fatal, especially in those days before there was modern medical techniques. And the physicians there consulted with one another, but without the chief doctor there, they weren't sure which treatment to do. So the Kol Aryeh is laying there, his life, standing between life and death, while the doctors debated what to do. And suddenly, in the quiet of the night, there was the sound of galloping horses and carriage wheels, and the hospital doors burst open, and the chief physician came in, looking as if he had left his house in a rush. And he said, where is the distinguished rabbi from Barak? The hospital staff was so shocked to see him, they didn't even answer him. How did the chief doctor possibly know about this patient? There were no telephones back then. Nobody had left the hospital to inform him. How did they know that there was a rabbi from a distant town? And without waiting for answers, the doctor rushed to the Kol Aryeh's bedside, and he quickly assessed the situation and then started giving instructions to his staff, and he personally performed all of the procedures needed to stop the bleeding. The next day, the Kol Aryeh's condition improved, and within a week, he was sitting up in bed, and the chief doctor would come and visit him daily. And one evening, as the Kol Aryeh was regaining his strength, the chief doctor pulled a chair up close to his bedside, and he said, Rabbi, I must tell you something extraordinary. On the night that you were brought here, I was at home already asleep in my bed, and suddenly I was woken up by the presence of an elderly Jewish man standing in front of me. He had a long white beard and piercing eyes that looked straight through me, and he dragged one leg as he moved. He was clearly a cripple. The Kol Aryeh's eyes widened because, as everybody knew, the Holy Sanzer Rebbe had been crippled since he was a child, and he walked with a limp. The doctor continued and he said, this strange visitor told me that I have to go immediately to the hospital because there's a very important rabbi there from the town of Barak who had just arrived in critical condition, and he said the other doctors wouldn't know how to save you. And I thought I was just dreaming, so I tried to go back to sleep. But this man came back to me and he shook me awake. He said, honored physician, a great rabbi is laying in your hospital in mortal danger, and the doctors can't find a solution. They desperately need you now. Hurry and run to the hospital. He was so insistent that I had no choice. I got up and I came here. I called to my assistant to prepare the carriage, and we rushed here as quickly as the horses could take us. And now I see that this was no ordinary dream. So please tell me, Rabbi, who was this limping man who appeared to me, and how could he have known about your condition? The Kol Aryeh, with tears in his eyes, he said, that was my Rebbe, the Holy Sanzer Rebbe. Weeks ago, I helped him raise money to free an innocent Jew from prison, and he promised me that this mitzvah would come to save me when I needed it. And now, through you, he has kept his word. The Kol Aryeh returned back home completely healed and continued leading his community. And each year, on the anniversary of his recovery, he would make a special Suda, a special feast of Thanksgiving, where he would tell this story and distribute charity generously, remembering how his own act of charity had returned to save his life. May we all merit to do the mitzvot with such devotion, and our good deeds come and save us in the times that we need. And may the memory of holy tzaddikim like the Sanzer Rebbe and the Kol Aryeh continue to inspire us to reach higher in our service of the Ribono Shel Olam, the Master of the Universe. I have one more story for you, and really it's just 3 very short stories. The first one is when the Rebbe Rashab, Reb Shalom Dober Schneerson, who lived from 1860 to 1920, was on a visit to Germany, and several local Jews came to meet him in the railway station. And as they stood on the platform, one of the Chassidim standing there looked at the large clock, and he said, "Rebbe, the train will be leaving in another minute." And the Rebbe turned to him with eyes shining with holy fire, and he said, "In 1 minute, a person can do tshuva." You see, my friends, you might look at it as 1 minute, but for the Rebbe, he saw it as an opportunity to fix everything. In the year 1944, the last Lubavitcher Rebbe, who was then the son-in-law of the Frierdiker Rebbe, was leading the davening after the passing of his father, Reb Levi Yitzchak Schneerson. And one day, the minyan did not start on time, and the Frierdiker Rebbe called the Rosh Yeshiva to his office, very concerned. He said to the Rosh Yeshiva, "My son-in-law complained about wasting time." And the Rosh Yeshiva said, "But Rebbe, the Bachrim, the yeshiva students, were only 5 minutes late," assuming that the small delay would not be a big deal. But the Frierdiker Rebbe looked at him and he said, "For my son-in-law, a minute is a year. So you want to steal 5 years from him?" You know, we might dismiss 5 minutes as nothing, check our phones, or look at something on the internet. But for the Rebbe, each of those minutes was Torah study or helping another Jew, and those minutes were precious. When the Frierdiker Rebbe arrived in America in 1940, he immediately started talking about how Mashiach is coming. But at the same time, he launched an ambitious effort to build yeshivot and strengthen Yiddishkeit through the whole country. And so people were confused. They said, if we're in exile only for a short while and Mashiach is coming, then why do we have to build all these buildings? The Frierdiker Rebbe said, during the 40 years of the Jews wandering in the desert, sometimes they remained in one place for many years. One time even 19 years. But in other places, they only stayed for a single day. But regardless, however long they were there, they fully set up the Mishkan with all of its kelim, all of its vessels, and brought all of the sacrifices, regardless of how long they stayed there. And so too we build the shuls and the yeshivot and the kosher restaurants and everything that we build in order to support the community, knowing that Mashiach can come in any second and take everyone to Eretz Yisrael. But until then, we continue building. We continue bringing Jews closer and closer until the great day comes that Hashem sends Mashiach Tzidkenu b'imheira b'yameinu, quickly in our time, Be'ezrat Hashem. Thank you so much for listening. As always, my sweetest friends, thank you to all the supporters of the podcast, all those that message me, email me, call me, meet me on the street. Shalom Aleichem to you all, and thank you very much. And I hope you have a beautiful Shabbos and a beautiful week. And until next week, my sweetest friends, take care of yourselves and sei gesund.